Hello, welcome to witnessaid UK. Today I'm going to tell you about my Watchtower leaving experience, which began in 1990. At the time, my wife and I were attending South Queensferry congregation. South Queensferry is a small town on the edge of Edinburgh at the west side of town. One Sunday morning I attended the Watchtower study with my wife. And during the question and answer session, which is the way the Watchtower study is done, there was a question asked and the answer given wasn't quite right. And I thought about it for a few minutes and I raised my hand, foolishly, and invited the person conducting the meeting, a male elder of course, if he would clarify the point and perhaps correct it if necessary. The elder himself was confused because he saw no problem with the answer that had been given to the question by a previous previous speaker. So after a few minutes discussion, a very brief discussion, I let it go and the meeting continued. What I had failed to realise, because I hadn't probably studied my Watchtower thoroughly before going to the meeting, is that new light had been introduced. So the day before I was absolutely right in what I thought, and on this particular day I was now wrong in what I thought, because the goalposts had been changed. As a result of this, in the following week, I was invited to a meeting with 3 elders, which of course was a judicial committee, although I wasn't told that at the time. And they accused me of apostasy for speaking out false teaching in the congregation. As a defence, I explained to them that I couldn't possibly be guilty of apostasy because, first of all, I was a true blue Jehovah's Witness and I had been for well over 20 years. And in any case, how could I be guilty of apostasy when, so far as I knew, what I was saying was true and I had simply made a mistake? Fortunately for me, they were clever enough to understand this defence. But because this incident had happened at a meeting in public, they couldn't let me away with that. So they imposed 6 months of restrictions upon me. And during that 6-month period, I would not be permitted to act as a man in the congregation. What that means is this: I wouldn't be allowed to pray on behalf of the congregation, or read scriptures, or go on the platform to give talks, or indeed do anything which involved speaking in the congregation. I would, however, be allowed to continue going from door to door preaching, and I was encouraged to do so. When I told my wife about this, she was deeply upset. And I think after seeing her father, who was an elder in Glasgow congregations, he advised us it might be better to move to another congregation during that 6-month period. So we went back to a congregation called Edinburgh Waverley, which is in the centre of town in Edinburgh. And I was well known there and had been since I was a child. And I hoped that things might be a little easier for us there. But that was not to be the case. Very quickly, my wife found it very difficult to get partners and companions to go out with her in her pioneering work. Because at this time, my wife was spending most of her time going from door to door, unpaid, at my expense, and with my encouragement, may I say. because that was the recommended thing to do for Jehovah's Witnesses. So she was very unhappy about that, and she probably blamed me for bringing this upon our family, our household. But at the same time, she also thought that putting me under restrictions was a very unfair thing to happen. Another difficulty was at the meetings. The congregation meetings where 90 or 100 people were in attendance were not so bad. But those of you who are former Jehovah's Witnesses know about the Tuesday book study. I say book study because it's not like a church Bible study group. It's a book study, studying a Watchtower book, using the Bible to support for support of scriptures. This is a small group held in a family home, and there are usually only 10 or a dozen people in attendance. So you can imagine that if a male witness is not allowed to speak in such a small group, it's going to be very, very noticeable indeed. And indeed, in fact, that's what the Watchtower wants. They want the so-called wrongdoer to be humiliated and punished. So on most occasions, I would attend this meeting with my wife, and what typically happens is that a man conducts the meeting, a man says a prayer at the beginning and at the end, and a man reads the paragraphs, a baptized male. When scriptures were read in this group, what happened was this. They would start at one corner of the room and they would go around inviting people to read a verse. Of course, when they came to this person, then this person here didn't get to read a scripture, and it was quietly moved on to the next person. But how obvious is it that a male witness is not in favour if he's not allowed to pray or to read paragraphs or to read scriptures? But one night things came to a head, because a young man came to the group study for the very first, and I believe the very last time, because I don't think I ever saw him again. He was just an interested person. So once again, the meeting was conducted in the usual way, and people took a turn going round the group reading a verse from the Bible. It came to the person next to me, then it jumped over to the person on my other side, and it went round the room. And then the young man who had come to the meeting for the very first time read a verse from the Bible. When I got home, my wife was fuming. I got a rocket for letting this happen to me. She was humiliated to see her husband treated in this way. And she said, if those bastards don't reinstate you next week, I'm never going to the meetings again. Now, that is the nicest thing she said about them. But I won't tell you the rest. So the following week, it was a Saturday afternoon, I met with two elders at Edinburgh Waverley Kingdom Hall. And I said, I've been a good boy for 6 months, I've been going round the doors, I've been attending the meetings regularly, my wife's pioneering, going round the doors full time. Isn't it time to lift the restrictions, please? And they said no. In fact, one of them, John Maxwell, said it with a smirk. He was enjoying his little sense of power. And he said to me, we can keep this going as long as we like. So, I was disappointed. I went home and I told my wife. You can imagine the reaction. she swore she would never go back to the meetings again, ever. And to her credit, she has never done so. My only regret is that, unlike me, she didn't go through a very good deprogramming of herself from Watchtower teaching. And I think this gave her many problems in the future. I think she's pretty much out of it now, mentally and emotionally, but it did affect her, and I think it is still affecting her in some measure. The next day was a Sunday, and my friend Amerigo Lani was giving a public talk. Now, about 15 years earlier, I had had a Bible study with Amerigo, and I brought him into the Watchtower. And I wanted to hear his talk. So I went along and listened to his public talk, and I left the meeting before the Watchtower study started, never to return to the Kingdom Hall. Or so I thought. During the next year or so, my wife and I were alone. Although we had not been disfellowshipped, or we had not disassociated ourselves, we were not attending meetings because we couldn't function inside the Kingdom Hall, and we found great difficulty trying to function outside the Kingdom Hall also. My wife's father made it very plain that he was suspicious of both of us because we had stopped attending meetings. One weekend, I was wanting to go through to Glasgow to play chess in a chess tournament because I was a strong club player at the time. And I phoned him and asked if I might stay overnight. This was my father-in-law. And he refused, told me quite bluntly, "You're not welcome here until we see how you stand with Jehovah." One or two friends among Jehovah's Witnesses did call on us from time to time, and they tried to encourage us to go back to the meetings, and we explained that to go back would simply continue the situation that had been going on before I left. And the other thing that was interesting is that we just had nothing in common with most of them. There were only 2 or 3, but we just had nothing in common with them because they wanted to talk Watchtower, meetings, preaching work, and we wanted to talk about life, almost anything else. And there were 1 or 2 embarrassing incidents when one couple came up in particular, and we gave them some food, and they were waiting for me to say a prayer. And I said, "What's holding you up? Just go ahead, eat." So I think they said a silent prayer and managed to swallow the food. As a result of this alienation, however, my wife and I had marital problems. Whereas in the past we might have had the support of the congregation, now we were alone. And things went worse and worse until eventually in 1991 we separated. We were later divorced a couple of years later by mutual agreement, although I was very unhappy about that idea. So my wife went her way in peace, and I continued in my photography business during the recession of the 1990s, and it was a very, very difficult time to be in business. I was a good photographer, and I won a Kodak award. I had a potentially good business, but the recession was making it extremely difficult, and finally I had to give it up. From time to time, Jehovah's Witnesses would call at my home, and they would encourage me to come back to the meetings, and I always declined. Then one day I was walking along Princes Street in Edinburgh, and I bumped into 3 Jehovah's Witnesses in the space of 2 or 3 hours on a busy Saturday afternoon. And of course they all were very friendly and invited me back to the meetings and encouraged me back and so on. And the next time Amerigo Lanny came with his wife to encourage me back, he said that he would make it easy for me to go back and not to suffer the same humiliation that I had been put under previously. The idea was that I should go back to the meetings and have a Bible study. Can you imagine that? I had been raised in the witness religion. I had been baptized for over 20 years, and they were offering me a Bible study. It was a reprogramming session, really. So Amerigo was sensible enough to understand that I should be giving him a Bible study, because, as I said, it was I who studied with him originally. So we came to an agreement that Amerigo, as an elder, would shepherd me and help me through this rehabilitation or reintegration period, because I certainly wasn't happy outside. I still believed the Watchtower teachings when I left in 1990. And the reason for that is because there was nothing out there that I could compare Watchtower teachings with. All I knew was that something was wrong in the organisation, and I just couldn't put my finger on it and understand why it was so bad. So I had several meetings with Amerigo, during which we chatted about the Bible and a few scriptures, and I gradually reintegrated myself back into the congregation until I was giving talks, going out from door to door, even saying prayers in the Kingdom Hall. But I was not happy. Why was I unhappy? Well, I was still traumatized from the separation from my wife. I missed her a lot. And I was having problems, a lot of pressure and difficulty and stress in my business as a photographer, a professional photographer. Also, I thought maybe I could make a new life for myself and meet a nice Jehovah's Witness woman, which my wife had been, and remarry. But you know, I looked around the Kingdom Hall and I said, no, that isn't going to happen. It's just not going to happen. I just couldn't see myself there with anyone. The other problem was this: the meetings were hateful. It was like a 1984 hate session. All the meetings seemed to focus on negativity. Hate the homosexuals, hate the Catholics, hate those worldly people, all the people out there. Bad, evil, nasty, vicious, immoral, disgusting. Isn't it wonderful that they'll be destroyed at Armageddon soon? That was the message I was hearing. And in my vulnerable state, emotionally and mentally, I was just unable to take this. And on quite a few occasions, I went home from the meetings actually crying. I think, in retrospect, I was learning compassion. I think I was becoming a Christian. I think I was learning empathy and understanding of people and recognizing that there are people outside the Watchtower. It's not a question of them and us. Another problem I had was in witnessing from door to door. I was embarrassed. I used to be so good going from door to door. I had the gift of the gab. But now I was embarrassed to invite people to meetings. I didn't really want anyone to have a Bible study with me, because I knew that the end result would mean that they would become Jehovah's Witnesses. And I knew that I wasn't happy as a Jehovah's Witness. So why would I want them to share what I was experiencing? And I remember one day I was out in the ministry with an older lady, and we knocked on a door, and the flat was empty of residents, but a painter came to the door. He was painting the flat, and it was the father of a bride I had photographed, and I recognised him and he recognised me, and I was so embarrassed. So that's how I was feeling. And after about another 18 months in the congregation, I said, like the animals, I've got to get out of here. I've got to get out of this place. But the question is, I didn't know how. And the other problem is that I still believed. So, by this time, my wife had remarried and she had a new baby son. And I was heartbroken because we had not had children together. And I remember the day that she gave birth, because for some strange reason, it was December the 25th, 1994. It was a Sunday. And I went to the meeting, as usual. She was still on friendly terms with me. And she phoned me, or I think her husband phoned me about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning to tell me that she had given birth to a son. And I said I would go up to see her after the meeting. So I went to the Kingdom Hall. I must have looked terrible with shock, because people commented on it. And after the meeting, I went to the maternity hospital and saw her son. And I was so happy for her that she had a child, and that she was also free from the Watchtower. And then I went home and I cried. I just broke down and cried for about 3 hours. And then, like King David, I washed my face and got back on with my life. But that was a very, very difficult day. So all this stuff's happening. Emotional, spiritual, mental. And I think it was January the 1st, 1995, I finally said, I'm not going back. I'm going to drag myself away. And I really did have to drag myself away, because I still believed it. I still believed the Watchtower teachings. I used to go around the botanical gardens thinking and thinking and thinking. And I remember one day I actually prayed to Jehovah. I don't know who he is now, by the way, but I prayed to Jehovah that he would give my place in the new paradise earth soon to my former wife and her child. That's how I felt. I was willing to give up my place in the lifeboat because I didn't want to live for 1,000 years in paradise with Jehovah's Witnesses. One day in August 1995, after I had been out of the meetings for several months, I had a very, very lucky experience. It was life-changing. Over the previous few months, a Jehovah's Witness friend was calling on me to have lunch with me while he was working in the neighbourhood. I used to go through to the kitchen to prepare lunch for him, and when I would come back, he would be fast asleep in the armchair. Why? Well, because he was a married man with 3 children. And sometimes he told me about the difficulties of having 3 children and getting them ready for meetings, and particularly the difficulty in taking them to assemblies, which would involve getting up very early in the morning to catch a coach, driving on the coach for maybe an hour and a half, and spending a whole day at the convention grounds, which would usually be a football stadium, a soccer stadium, and then coming back on the coach about 7 or 8 p.m, putting the children to bed, and then getting up the next morning to repeat the process for 2 or 3 days. So he was exhausted. But on one particular day in August 1995, he was angry and confused because he had just been to the meeting the day before, studying, I think it was the 15th of August Watchtower, and it was talking about the generation. Now, if you think the recent new light on the generation is something new, you're wrong. This was another piece of new light on the generation. And I suspect that they got it from an apostate book written by Raymond Franz. Because in his book, it was either Crisis of Conscience or In Search of Christian Freedom, he proposed that the Watchtower would have to find a way of separating the 1914 date from the end of the system of things and Armageddon. Because as you may know, this is supposed to occur within one generation. Now, over the last 80 years, the Watchtower had been shifting the goalposts all the time to define a generation. You can do research on that. And here they were, finally finding a way to separate the date by making, I think it was a floating generation. But it was a different point from the one that was made in the last year or so. So my friend said, I can't get my head around this. I've thought about it, I've researched, I've looked up the books. I can't understand the logic of this. I just don't get it. Can you help me? Because I had 40 years of Watchtower experience. And I said, no, I haven't got a clue. I don't know. How can I give you the answer to that? That would require logic. And this hypothesis is not logical, as Mr. Spock might say. So I said, but I'll tell you what I will do. I've got the internet now. I'll see if I can find the answer on the internet. So I did. I typed in just 2 or 3 words on my computer screen, and I pressed the button, and there before my eyes was all the evidence I needed to get me out of the Watchtower. I looked up the point that he had asked me about, and I also got a copy of Crisis of Conscience, and I read eagerly every single website, every single article that I could get my hands on. And when he came up again, I said, I don't think I've got the answer, but what about this? And when I told him what I had learned, just some of the things I had learned, he was frightened, because he saw the consequences that would come about in his marriage if he left the Watchtower without his wife and children. So over the next few months, he began reading, and he gradually introduced his wife to the things he was learning, and they managed to exit the Watchtower themselves about 9 months or a year later. And it wasn't actually very difficult to persuade his wife, because having 3 children, they were despised in the congregation because of not attending the meetings regularly, because of not going round the doors often enough. So, if you're an activist against Jehovah's Witnesses right now, do it gently, do it honestly, do it kindly, because all you need to do is tell the truth about Jehovah's Witnesses, and they will damn themselves because of their teachings, their policies, their conduct, and the way they treat people in the congregation. After that, I read everything I could get my hands on. I read the 2 Franz books, Johnson's books, Penton's Apocalypse Delayed. I read every article I could find on the internet. I looked at old Watchtowers. I had a Watchtower CD-ROM library, which I studied extensively. In fact, I should really have a degree in Watchtower study, because by the time I was finished, I knew almost everything about the Watchtower. I could have quoted you chapter and verse of Watchtower books. I could have quoted you chapter and verse of the Bible, because by this time I had read the whole Bible for the first time in my life. So after 40 years as a Jehovah's Witness, I was able to read the whole Bible in just a few weeks. And I then read the New Testament in various translations about 7 or 8 times. So I really knew everything I needed to know about the Watchtower, and for the first time I had enough information to cleanse my mind, which had been mentally diseased by the meaningless and contradictory assertions of the Watchtower religion. I had had a difficult time getting out of the Watchtower, and I felt compassion when I realised that there were many, many other people who must be in the same situation. So I wrote a website called witnessaid UK. And I have reinstated that recently as a blog. You can find it at witnessaid.blogspot.com. And there I've reproduced some of the articles that I wrote originally on the site, and I've also added a discussion of basic Watchtower teachings taken from the book What Does the Bible Really Teach? So I invite you to look at those articles, especially if you're having a Bible study with Jehovah's Witnesses at the moment. So from time to time the elders would call and I would always be too busy. And at that particular time in the late 90s, the Watchtower had just put up its website, which was called watchtower.org. Up till then, they had been telling Jehovah's Witnesses not to look at the internet. But they themselves published a website round about the same time I published mine, actually. So it's quite a new idea. And I don't think YouTube was going at that particular time, in the late 90s. My life was still difficult. I had become unemployed, or I was just working part-time by this stage, and I wasn't. I was content, but I wasn't thriving particularly well. But I was fairly content, and I was certainly happier spiritually. And although I was a little emotionally vulnerable, because I was still grieving my marriage, I was fairly happy. And then, 3 years after I quietly drifted away, I had a phone call one morning. It was a Saturday the 27th of February 1998. And as a result of that phone call, I had judicial meetings with Watchtower elders. And I'll tell you about those judicial meetings in the next video. Thanks for listening.